the 70s and then into the 80s, there was this dramatic surge in crime rates and violent crimes, and in particular African Americans suffered from because African Americans are disproportionately the victims of crime, and so you had a real sense of existential crisis in the country around crime. There was also a broad view, and certainly President Nixon shared this and other politicians, that the system had become too lenient and that it was too easy for lawbreakers to escape punishment. And so there was actually something of a consensus that we've got to really crack down. And even if you look back at the polling, even African Americans to some degree felt that way in that period of time. And so was it just or was it?
Well, I think it's a little more complicated than that. I actually think at the point at which Richard Nixon was declaring a war on drugs, we had not seen any increase in the violent crime rate. He was really responding to the chaos and the disorder on college campuses of students organizing and protesting the war. The narrative was they're only protesting, these are good kids that are protesting because they've been disrupted by drugs, LSD, and that was the narrative. And it had nothing to do really with violent crime, and that's when we began to create these drug laws. In the late 70s and early 80s. The peak in violent crime actually begins in the late 80s when the restrictions on access to drugs, when drug dealing became so challenging that it was taken over by violent gangs. And you had people in really low-income communities seeing the drug trade become this incredibly attractive way to make money. But for the drug laws of the mid-70s and early 80s, I'm not sure we would have seen that peak in violence. And then you had an epidemic of violence in communities that had been largely abandoned. When Lyndon Johnson was talking about the Great Society, when people were actually talking about interventions to help people recover from generational poverty, there was hopefulness. When that was abandoned during the Reagan years, and when Congress started this narrative of hating the poor, judging the poor, you saw despair grow in these communities. You saw kids being born into violent families where they had to deal with violent neighborhoods and violent schools, and that violence creating trauma. And by the early 90s, that trauma led to people joining gangs or abusing drugs, and we had this epidemic of violence. But even after that calmed down, we continued to put people in jails and prisons at these record levels. So I think there has been a peak, there was a peak in the violent crime rate in the late 80s and early 90s, but it doesn't really explain this dramatic increase in over-incarceration. I think that's explained by these larger narratives. In many communities today, the violent crime rate is about where it was in the 1960s, and yet we have 2.3 million people in jails and prisons.